Every year, Americans spend more than $2 billion on lawn chemicals, herbicides, selective weed killers, and pre-emergent treatments spread across manicured grass like a slow-moving eraser. In that same period, the global antibiotic resistance crisis continues to deepen, with more than 1.2 million people dying annually from infections no available drug can treat. These two facts rarely get examined side by side, yet they should be, because the very plants so many people spend decades eliminating from their yards, spraying, pulling, smothering, and cursing, are among the most chemically sophisticated antimicrobial organisms to ever grow from soil. This is not speculation. It is documented in peer-reviewed research. Compounds found in their leaves, roots, and stems have been shown to suppress bacterial strains that resist our most powerful pharmaceuticals, and they have quietly done so for thousands of years. What follows is a countdown of 12 such plants, most of which are likely growing within 20 feet of any front door in the country. 12. Cleavers, the lymphatic whisper. Most people know this plant only as a nuisance, the sticky weed, Galium aperine, that clings to clothing with tiny hooks when brushed against in tall grass. Monks called it cleaverwort, and within the herb gardens of 12th century Benedictine monasteries, it was specifically used for swollen lymph nodes and glands that would not drain, treating the quiet internal buildup that precedes visible infection. What the monks observed and what researchers are now investigating is that cleavers contain iridoid glycosides, tannins, and a specific anthraquinone called aspergilloside. Laboratory studies suggest this compound shows activity against several gram-positive bacterial strains linked to skin and soft tissue infections. Traditional Chinese medicine independently classified cleavers as a lymphatic herb, and Ayurvedic practitioners in India use the same plant, known there as Madhu parnika, for similar purposes involving swelling and glandular stagnation. Three unconnected traditions arriving at the same conclusion is worth noting. To use cleavers, young stems gathered in early spring before the hooks harden can be juiced or cold steeped in refrigerated water for 8 hours, never heated, since heat degrades the active compound. A small glass taken in the morning on an empty stomach has a mild, almost neutral taste, reminiscent of the water left over from washing fresh spinach. The precise mechanisms remain under study, but the consistency of use across unrelated cultures is notable. 11. Ground elder, the gout plant that builds forts. This is a plant the Romans deliberately carried into northern Europe as both food and medicine, planting it beside garrison outposts from Britain to Germany. When the empire fell, the plant remained and spread through every garden it ever touched, never leaving. Modern gardeners regard ground elder, Egopodium podagraria, as one of the most aggressively invasive weeds in temperate climates, yet the Romans considered it essential. The reason lies in falcarinol, a polyacetylene compound concentrated in the stems and leaves that research suggests has antibacterial properties, apparently working in part by disrupting bacterial membrane synthesis, a mechanism distinct from most conventional antibiotics. In a landscape where bacteria are developing workarounds to standard treatments with alarming speed, a compound acting through a less familiar pathway is worth attention, and Scandinavian botanical research institutions have found results consistent enough to justify continued study. Traditionally, the plant was eaten as a spring vegetable, briefly boiled and served with butter like spinach, tasting of fresh carrot tops with a faint anise note, mild and slightly sweet when young. An important preparation detail is that only the youngest shoots, gathered before flowering, should be used, since falcarinol levels shift afterward and the leaves turn noticeably bitter and less useful. 10. Self-heal, a name that says it all. Prunella vulgaris carries an unusually direct name, self-heal, the plant that heals itself and, by extension, whoever uses it. It grows low, with small purple flowers, in lawns and disturbed soil, easily overlooked. Medieval surgeons called it carpenter's herb because it was often the first remedy applied to woodworking injuries. The Iroquois used it for infected throat ulcers, and traditional Chinese medicine used it under the name Siaku Kao, specifically for bacterial infections of the glands and throat. Its active compound, Rosmarinic acid, also found in rosemary and lemon balm, has been identified by researchers as having meaningful antimicrobial activity, particularly against oral and respiratory pathogens. What makes self-heal especially unusual is a polysaccharide it produces called prunellin, which studies suggest may interfere with certain bacteria's ability to attach to mucosal tissue, addressing one of the earliest stages of infection before it can take hold. Rosmarinic acid receives attention elsewhere, but prunellin is rarely discussed, even though most people walk past this plant without a second thought. It can be prepared as a simple infusion, a tablespoon of fresh leaves and flowers steeped for 7 minutes in water just off the boil, strained, slightly bitter and herbal, softened with raw honey, and taken at the first sign of a scratchy throat. Research is ongoing, but traditional consensus across several independent medical systems is consistent. 9. Sheep sorrel, a mineral reservoir in the lawn. Rumex acetosella thrives in poor, acidic soil, precisely the conditions gardeners tend to dislike most in a lawn. Its triangular, arrow-shaped leaves have an almost prehistoric look and a sharply sour, almost electric taste due to oxalic acid and anthraquinone glycosides, including chrysophenol and amodin, compounds studied for antibacterial activity against certain gut pathogens. Less widely known, even among health enthusiasts, is that sheep sorrel contains unusually high concentrations of flavonoids such as vitexin and isovitexin, which have been examined for activity against Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium responsible for most stomach ulcers. These same compounds appear in some of the world's most expensive specialty teas and in passion flower leaves, yet here they grow freely in a neglected lawn. Indigenous North American groups, particularly Algonquin communities, use sheep sorrel for digestive infections and fevers, while European folk medicine treated it as a cooling remedy for inflammation. Even a small amount of dried sheep sorrel provides measurable iron and vitamin C. It should be used sparingly, a few leaves in a salad or a small infusion no more than once daily, since its oxalic acid content makes regular high-volume consumption inadvisable. But as an occasional targeted remedy, its traditional reputation appears well supported by the research on its compounds. 8. Wood sorrel, the forgotten wound wash. Distinct from sheep sorrel, though related, Oxalis acetosella is a small clover-shaped plant that grows in cool, damp shade and folds its leaves at night as though sleeping. Many find it attractive and still pull it relentlessly from shaded beds. The Celts regarded it as sacred, linking its three-lobed leaves to Trinitarian symbolism, and Irish monks carried it through centuries of upheaval as part of their wound washing and infection formulas, thanks to its tannin content, which provides astringent properties, along with a notable amount of vitamin C, historically used to help prevent scurvy where citrus was unavailable. A key preparation detail separates effective medicinal use from simply enjoying it in a salad. Extracting its astringent tannins for wound care requires cold pressing rather than heating, since heat volatilizes the tannins, while cold extraction preserves them. A good handful of fresh leaves crushed and pressed through clean cloth yields a pale green, slightly viscous, sour juice suitable for direct application. In a salad, wood sorrel tastes like lemon with a clean, cool finish, and unlike its sheep sorrel relative, it can be eaten in moderate amounts without concern. 7. Plantain, sometimes called the bandage of God. Here the research grows substantially deeper. Plantago major and its relative Plantago lanceolata, the broadleaf and narrowleaf plantains, grow in compacted soil along driveways, through gravel, and in every neglected corner of temperate lawns. Their old name, the bandage of God, was meant literally rather than poetically, echoing biblical references to the land yielding healing herbs. Plantain appears in Anglo-Saxon medical texts, including the 9th century Leech Book of Bald, one of the oldest surviving English-language medical manuscripts, where it was prescribed for infected wounds, snake bites, and festering ulcers, and it was used independently by the Cherokee and other traditions with no historical contact with one another. Its key compound is aucubin, an iridoid glycoside with documented broad-spectrum antibacterial activity. When fresh leaf tissue is crushed and its cell walls break, aucubin converts first into cattle and then into compounds shown to directly inhibit Staphylococcus aureus, including methicillin-resistant strains. Those earlier traditions had no laboratory confirmation, only generations of careful observation, and modern research is only now catching up to explain why their conclusions held. A second compound, allantoin, promotes cell growth and wound healing, and is already used in commercial wound creams, despite being freely available in a plant growing through driveway cracks. For minor cuts, stings, or irritated skin, crushed fresh leaves applied directly bring a noticeable cooling effect within minutes. For internal use, a handful of fresh leaves cold steeped overnight produces a mild vegetal infusion, subtle and unremarkable to the taste, even as its healing effect is anything but. 6. Dandelion, a stubborn defender of the liver. Taraxacum officinale is arguably the most despised plant in American lawn culture, so hated that products designed specifically to kill it generate more than $500 million annually, a striking figure given that Hippocrates prescribed it. 10th century Persian physicians used it for liver and bile conditions, and Chinese imperial medicine included it in official texts for over 1,000 years. Ancient traditions of consuming bitter herbs, referenced even in the biblical account of the Israelites' wilderness diet, treated bitterness itself as part of the healing process, and dandelion's bitterness is very much the point rather than a drawback. Its bitter compounds, taraxacin and taraxacarin, stimulate bile production and liver activity, addressing the kind of internal stagnation ancient healers associated with the earliest stages of illness. Modern research has found that taraxacin inhibits certain gram-positive bacteria linked to internal abscesses, while the root's inulin content, a prebiotic fiber, feeds gut bacteria responsible for producing short-chain fatty acids, now considered central to intestinal immunity. Roasting the root concentrates these compounds while transforming the flavor into something smoky, earthy, and chocolate bitter, a preparation the French have long enjoyed as café de pissenlit. During the Second World War, when antibiotic supplies were scarce, nurses in occupied European hospitals turned to dandelion not as a replacement for penicillin, but as a genuinely useful bridge treatment given its antimicrobial activity. It can be prepared by simmering a tablespoon of chopped root in 2 cups of water for 20 minutes at a gentle simmer, producing a dark, bitter, earthy decoction, sweetened with honey if desired. Research into its mechanisms continues, building on a reputation already thousands of years old. 5. Purslane, a biofilm disruptor the world eats but America ignores. Portulaca oleracea, the low, fleshy succulent that spreads across garden beds after summer rain, is a mainstream food across 5 continents and has been for 3,000 years, eaten in Greek fattoush, cooked with yogurt in Turkey as semizotu, braised with chili and pork in Mexico under the name verdolagas, and consumed across the Middle East since before recorded agriculture. The United States remains one of the few places to classify it purely as a weed to be eradicated. Without the language of modern chemistry, cultures around the world recognize that purslane contains marine-type omega-3 fatty acids, specifically eicosapentaenoic acid, at concentrations unusual for a land plant. Most plant sources provide only ALA, which the body must convert, whereas purslane delivers EPA directly, the same form found in oily fish. What earns it a place on this list, however, is a separate mechanism. The mucilaginous polysaccharides responsible for its characteristic slipperiness appear to disrupt bacterial biofilms, the protective structures bacteria build to withstand antibiotics at concentrations far higher than they could survive alone, apparently by interfering with the quorum-sensing signals bacteria use to construct and maintain those structures. Research here is still in early stages, but if the mechanism is confirmed, it could represent a meaningful addition to antibacterial strategy. Purslane is delicious eaten raw in salads, with a pleasant saltiness, faint sourness, and the crunch of young cucumber, or briefly sautéed with garlic, olive oil, and lemon until it turns silky, though cooking beyond a couple of minutes destroys both the omega-3 content and the delicate polysaccharides. The best harvest time is mid-morning on dry days once the dew has lifted, and it freezes reasonably well if blanched first. 4. Chickweed, the healer that never sleeps through winter. Anyone relying on medicinal plants eventually confronts winter, when most of nature's pharmacy shuts down even though infections do not pause with it. Stellaria media, chickweed, solves that problem elegantly. It germinates in autumn as most plants die back, continues growing beneath light snow cover, and is often the only visibly green living thing in a garden during February. Its small, star-shaped white flowers and tender water-filled stems contain antimicrobial compounds active against candida fungi and gram-negative bacteria, including strains of E. coli linked to urinary tract infections. Its main active agents are saponins and a flavonoid called rutin, both studied for anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects, and also found in other well-regarded medicinal plants. The saponin content gives chickweed its soapy feel when rubbed between the fingers. In Appalachia, a chickweed poultice was historically called poor man's medicine, made by crushing the whole fresh plant with a bit of rendered lard, which acted as a carrier, holding the active compounds against the skin for extended periods, and applying it to abscesses, boils, and infected wounds. An important preparation detail often left out elsewhere is that chickweed saponins, while water-soluble, are also fairly heat-sensitive. So topical use calls for fresh or room temperature infused oil, warmed at no more than about 40 degrees Celsius for 6 to 8 hours, while internal use is best served by a cold water infusion left overnight, which captures the saponins more effectively than hot tea. Fresh chickweed tastes remarkably mild and sweet for a medicinal herb, reminiscent of the first bite of very young corn, and should be harvested before the flowers fade, since the saponin profile shifts toward bitterness afterward. That ideal harvest window is brief, often only 2 or 3 weeks in late autumn and again in earliest spring. 3. Stinging nettle, an armored defender against blood infection. It is worth addressing the obvious drawback first. Nettle stings. Urtica dioica is covered in microscopic silica-tipped hairs that inject an irritating mixture on contact, producing an immediate, burning, long-lasting sting that keeps insects, browsing animals, and frustrated gardeners alike at bay. What those same frustrated gardeners may not realize is what they are removing from their landscape. Nettle root contains a lectin protein called Urtica dioica agglutinin, or UDA, which binds to and disrupts the cell membranes of drug-resistant gram-positive bacteria by targeting specific surface proteins rather than launching a generalized chemical attack, a mechanism European university research has identified as potentially significant precisely because that resistance pathway is harder for bacteria to evade when the target is external. Ancient Hebrew texts describe desolate places using a word sometimes translated as nettle or thorns, suggesting the plant was familiar enough in the ancient Near East to serve as a marker for abandoned, unhealed ground, while Roman records describe the deliberate transport of nettle seeds to Britain as both food and medicine, with soldiers documented rubbing nettle leaves on arthritic joints in a practice modern physiotherapy has revisited and found plausibly effective at temporarily reducing pain. During the First World War, when cotton supplies ran short, German forces wove nettle fibers into wound dressings. Though less soft than cotton, the fibers likely release small amounts of UDA and formic acid directly into the wound, a passive antiseptic effect embedded in the bandage itself. Heat fully neutralizes the sting. 30 seconds in boiling water denatures both the microscopic hairs and the formic acid, leaving greens that taste like spinach with a deeper, earthier, faintly marine character, used in Italian nettle risotto and Irish nettle soup with potatoes, onion, and cream. Only the top 4 to 6 leaves picked before flowering should be blanched for eating. Nutritionally, the plant is genuinely impressive, higher in iron than spinach with significant calcium and vitamin K, and a tea made by simmering a teaspoon of chopped dried root in 2 cups of water for 15 minutes has long been used in European herbal medicine for prostate support and seasonal allergy relief, an application some herbalists and urologists consider worth discussing with a qualified practitioner. 2. Yarrow, the soldier's companion. There is a recurring moment in human conflict across civilizations that had no contact with one another. A soldier wounded, the wound deep and dirty, and a healer reaching for the same plant, feathery leaves, flat clusters of white flowers, an aroma somewhere between wild sage and warm camphor. Achillea millefolium takes its name directly from Achilles, since Homer records him using yarrow to stop his soldiers bleeding and prevent the infections that killed nearly as many men as enemy weapons did, and classical sources refer to it as herba militaris, the soldier's herb. The Chinese included it in the I Ching as a divination plant and in the Shen Nong Ben Chao Jing, the divine farmer's classic of materia medica, while the Navajo, Norse, and Ojibwe traditions all independently arrived at the same plant for similar purposes. Recent research has begun catching up with that consensus. In 2018, work from the University of Thrace in Greece found that yarrow essential oil showed effectiveness against methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus in laboratory settings comparable to vancomycin, one of the antibiotics reserved as a last resort for such infections. The mechanism appears to involve a combination of the sesquiterpene lactone achillin, the flavonoid apigenin, and several lesser-studied borneol derivatives working together rather than any single isolated compound, which likely explains why extracted single compounds tend to underperform compared to whole plant preparations in existing research. A further unusual effect researchers have documented is that yarrow compounds appear to activate macrophages, the white blood cells responsible for finding and destroying bacteria throughout the body, suggesting yarrow may not only act externally, but also help prime the body's own internal defenses, a qualitatively different mechanism from a standard antibiotic if larger studies confirm it. Scholars of ancient Levantine plant use have noted that the biblical account of the prophet Ezekiel being sustained by a compound cake of grains and legumes likely included wild aromatic herbs, such as yarrow gathered from the same fields, since in the ancient Near East, the line between food and medicine was far less distinct than it is today. To use yarrow, 2 teaspoons of dried flowers and leaves steeped covered in water just off the boil for 10 to 12 minutes, and then strained produce a complex, bitterly aromatic tea with a camphor-like finish and lingering warmth. Swedes traditionally combined yarrow flowers with honey and a little grain alcohol into a post-dinner digestive tonic taken for centuries after the evening meal. Taken at the onset of fever or infection, before eating in the morning, yarrow's traditional use long predates any clinical trial, and research continues to explore why it worked. 1. Creeping Charlie, the weed that refuses to die and refuses to let you down. Almost everyone has pulled this plant from a garden bed in frustration at some point. Glaucoma heteracea, known variously as ground ivy, creeping Charlie, alehoof, or gill over the ground, spreads by runners along the soil surface, rooting at every node and colonizing every corner of a garden regardless of shade, sun, dry soil, clay, or cracks between paving stones, retreating briefly under herbicide, only to return again and again. It has been doing so for a very long time. The Anglo-Saxons, not a people given to romantic naming, called it alehoof for exactly what it did: clarify and preserve ale. Before hops became the standard bittering and preserving agent across Northern European brewing, brewers used this weed instead, and German historical records confirm its use in brewing as far back as the 10th century, meaning generations of ale drinkers were unknowingly consuming one of the more potent antibacterial plants in the European herbal tradition. Its active compounds are a polysaccharide called glycomannan and ursolic acid, a triterpenoid compound also found in the waxy coating of apple skins and rosemary leaves, but concentrated with unusual density in creeping Charlie's small scalloped leaves. Ursolic acid has been studied for activity against anaerobic bacteria, the kind that thrive in oxygen-depleted environments such as dead tissue and deep wounds, precisely where conventional antibiotics, which generally rely on oxygen-dependent bacterial metabolism, tend to struggle. Anglo-Saxon healers specifically used ground ivy for necrotic wounds and stubborn ulcers that would not close, a use that lines up closely with where ursolic acid appears to have its most distinctive effect. At the same time, ursolic acid appears to stimulate new capillary growth, helping healthy blood vessels form in damaged tissue to support repair, an effect old healers described poetically as the plant that drives out poison and calls back life, a description that modern molecular findings match with surprising precision. To prepare it, fresh leaves and young stems gathered in spring or early autumn, when ursolic acid concentration peaks before summer heat redirects the plant's energy toward reproduction, can be steeped as a simple infusion, a tablespoon of torn leaves in a cup of warm, not boiling, water around 70 degrees Celsius, covered for 8 minutes, since boiling can degrade its more delicate polysaccharides. The flavor is among the most distinctive on this list, related to mint and sage yet deeper, resinous, almost like the forest floor after rain, slightly bitter and slightly sweet with a lingering finish. Applied externally, a strong cold infusion steeped overnight makes an effective wash for slow-healing wounds and skin infections, since cold extraction better preserves both the ursolic acid and the polysaccharides than heat does. This plant asks nothing in return, no watering, no fertilizing, no protection, only that it be left alone. A final word on preparation. A principle runs through every plant on this list that deserves to be stated plainly, since most discussions of herbal medicine skip past it. The active compounds involved are fragile, sensitive to specific temperatures, and easily degraded by prolonged heat, ultraviolet light, or the kind of industrial processing that reduces a complex living plant to a standardized extract. Aucuben in plantain begins converting to inactive compounds within hours of exposure to heat above roughly 85 degrees Celsius. The EPA in purslane oxidizes quickly when dried at high temperatures. The UDA lectin in nettle root denatures above about 60 degrees Celsius, which is why traditional preparations were always cold processed or taken as tinctures rather than boiled. Ursolic acid is fat-soluble rather than water-soluble, meaning a plain water infusion captures only a fraction of what is available, which is likely why the Anglo-Saxons brewed Creeping Charlie in alcohol and fat-based preparations without any formal chemistry to explain why it mattered. This raises a deeper question worth sitting with. How much of what has been lost is not simply the plants themselves, but the knowledge of how to properly prepare them? How often has a traditional remedy been tested, found ineffective, and dismissed as folklore, when in fact the extraction method used destroyed the very compound being sought? The plants themselves have survived everything thrown at them. It is the knowledge of how to work with them that proves far more fragile. And one last recommendation before finishing. When you harvest, always keep more rhizomes than you think you will need. The first year I kept only a few, thinking that would be enough, and several were lost during storage. Since then, I always keep more than I need. The extras I give away, and honestly, I like doing that because it helps this plant spread little by little. Yacon deserves to be better known. It makes no sense that a plant so easy to grow, so productive, and so pleasant to eat should remain almost unknown to so many people. If you enjoy discovering useful crops, uncommon foods, and simple ways to produce more with less effort, subscribe to Lost Homestead Vault and join us in the next videos.